everyone to this St Mary's and Leinster Rugby webinar on tactical periodisation in rugby. We're really grateful for everyone logging on this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. So thank you for giving up your time to listen to some great guests that we've got in store for you. Just some general housekeeping. So if you have a look down at your page, there will be a Q&A function. If you can use that for any question and answers or questions that you might have throughout the webinar, that would be great. Try not to use the chat function if you can, because that normally gets clogged up a little bit. So if you can use the Q&A function, that would be brilliant. That will be monitored throughout the webinar, so we'll begin to summarise questions or answer questions individually. That will be done verbally through the webinar, or you may well get a written response from one of the panelists. So just keep an eye out from that. And finally, we'd like to carry the conversation on, if you could. So we've created a hashtag, not the most original, but hopefully it will work. It's hashtag TACT, so that's TACT, periodisation with an S, rugby. So if you have any take-home messages from this webinar, we'd be extremely grateful for you to use that hashtag, and so we can begin to carry on the conversation beyond this hour or hour and a half that we will have with you. So that's the boring stuff to start with. I'll introduce you to the panelists. Very briefly, guys, if we can go around just introducing ourselves, that would be very much appreciated. So Mike, could you just introduce yourself to
Yeah, of course. Mike Ashford. I'm a PhD student at Leeds Beckett University. Currently finishing off my PhD, which has been around understanding player decision making, how they make decisions, but also how as coaches we can better develop it. And I'm also a rugby coach at Harrogate Rugby Club and Leeds University.
Brilliant. Cheers, Mike. Jason, can I hand over to you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jason T. My job that pays the bills at the moment is I'm a lecturer in sports studies at Durban University of Technology. I've got a background in coaching. I've been coaching rugby mostly in high schools, youth sports for about 15 years. But I had the opportunity to venture into some university rugby with Mike Ashford a few years ago, and I managed to link up with an international sevens side for a little while, which also added to the experience.
Brilliant, Jason. Thank you. Brett.
Hi everyone, my name is Brett Igo. I'm a PhD student as well. I also lecture in the Institute of Technology in Carlow, where I lecture on a Master's in Sports Performance Analysis. I'm also the assistant coach of Leinster 18s and UCD's AAL coach.
Brilliant, thank you. And Declan, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Declan O'Brien, coach development manager with Leinster Rugby. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank the guest speakers tonight, the panelists, for putting all this presentation together. And I really look forward to the interaction from everybody online at the moment. It's fantastic. Thanks,
Brilliant.
Guys.
Cheers, Declan. Thank you for that. And finally from me, you probably won't hear from me too much. I'll be overseeing stuff and chivvying people along. But my name's Michael Ayres. I'm a senior lecturer at St Mary's University on our undergraduate and postgraduate programs and our new Rugby Performance Masters, and I'm still currently at Chelsea Football Club and have been so for the last 15 years, as well as doing some research with Leinster. So that provides some context to who we are. We're really fortunate enough, and the sort of stimulus for this webinar came from a former colleague at Leinster, Derek Maybury, who got in contact with Jason and Mike after they published a paper on tactical periodisation. So one of the key aims of the webinar today is to try and obviously understand some of the theory, but to really put in place some practical solutions to how we might apply the model, whether we are in full-time sport or whether we work within a club setting. So we'll begin. as I said, keep on firing the questions through. We will answer those throughout. We'll also have some time at the end. So, Mike, could you kick us off, please?
Yeah, by all means. Okay, so I'm just going to set the scene, really. This first started with me and Jason when we were on a bus on a journey up to Scotland for a game. And we were discussing the idea of tactical periodisation and thought, this isn't something that's really been studied or explored in rugby, aside from hearing that it was something that Eddie Jones operationalised. And it suddenly became a bit of a brainchild of ours moving forward, both theoretically from a research point of view, but also practically in our coaching. And I guess tactical periodisation is very much, to use a Steve Coveyism, it's an attempt to start with the end in mind. And what I mean by that is, how are we going to play the game and how can we get to that point? And that would be the easiest way I'd describe tactical periodisation. I've just included a number of quotes here that best capture it and conceptualise it. So the first is, what is tactically desirable must be technically possible from Launder. And it pretty much implies that if we have a tactical aim or vision or outcome, then the physical, technical and psychological need to equate to that. And as with our quote from our paper there, any physical or technical action has a tactical intention. So pretty much tactical periodisation isn't a rigid approach. The approach is very much dictated by a way of playing the game that is born from the coaches and the players that you have. So there is a huge amount of flexibility. And I think that is something that we're really going to try and hit home as we look to work from the bottom up here, that there is a flexibility to this approach. Brett, could we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so realistically, the starting point comes with this idea of simplifying complexity. And as I said before, starting with the end in mind. So what is the vision of performance? And to use another one of my colleagues, Sergio Larabertial, they conducted a study on serial winning coaches across multiple sports and identified that the best, and by best, Pep Guardiola didn't meet the criteria for this study. He wasn't deemed good enough to be included in the study. So that gives you an indication what they meant by serial winning coaches. And they pretty much identified that two key characteristics of serial winning coaches are the ability, one, to simplify the complexities of the game they work within, and two, that they have vision ahead of what's going on in the game at present. So they're able to predict things like rule changes or tactical modifications in the game. And a real simple way to start with this is to truly understand the moments of the game from a tactical periodisation perspective, which from a rugby perspective, could we, next slide please, Brett, if that's okay? Thank you. So I break down the game into three different areas here. So these three things are all much of a muchness. So game moments, principles of play and performance problems are three different ways of saying exactly the same thing. This is the constant. So with every game, with every invasion game, you have a set of rules and you have a pre-illusory goal. So the pre-illusory goal in rugby union is to score more points than your opponent. Okay, simple. And the rules then prohibit certain means in order to achieve that. And these game moments, principles of play, performance problems are what are then born from that interaction between the rules and the pre-illusory goal. So you can go either way. You can start with game moments or performance problems or principles of play. Now, in my perspective, I like to use performance problems. And the reason why is because for every problem that the rules present, such as, right, we've got to penetrate and score or progress the ball, we as a team, as a collective, need to come up with a solution to that, a tactical solution that then guides technical, physical, and psychological characteristics that are then demanded. And just by simply coming up with moments, principles, or performance problems, we capture what is an inherently complex game into 6 or 7 components. Next slide, please, Brett. So I think the first stage after this is to then use those principles, moments, or performance problems to then start to consider what the ideal vision of performance looks like for each one of those tactical solutions. And I put there on the grass So what would this look like? What does that vision look like for each solution? So how are we going to penetrate and score? How are we going to progress the ball? Or how are we going to win the ball back when we're defending? And then we start to consider what Pam Richards and Dave Collins would call an alpha version, so the ultimate vision of performance. But then we have to take into account the idea that we have a set number of players already that we're working with who possess an amount of capabilities, and that we have to take into account those capabilities when considering the tactical solutions we're going to use. And then we also can consider, if we're working in a developmental perspective or developmental context, well, we might set those solutions a year ahead. So in other words, where can we get them to? And then we start to shape a beta version, again, using Pam Richards and Dave Collins' work. So we start to shape the tactical solutions through the minds of the players. So to use a Victor Frey quote there, the solution should be born in the player's mind first. And that's not to say that the solution should be dictated by the players themselves. They should simply be created with a knowledge and a clear understanding of what the players can already do. And from there, you can start to consider, with these tactical solutions, a common language that is mutually understood between coaches and players and support staff alike. So pretty much what we're getting into there is we have these tactical solutions that then start to form a way of playing. And from there, you can start to consider as a coach, right, we have this way of playing, these ideal solutions. Now we can start to consider the capabilities that need to be nurtured or developed. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Brett? Thank you. So then we can start to also consider, we've got the capabilities that need to be developed, but we need to understand the context in which those capabilities need to be operationalized. So at any level, with any context you're working in, there is going to be a certain level of match demand or game demand. And these, again, are going to be technical, physical, psychological. So with that, we can start to align the capability that needs to be developed within training to the game demands to better prepare our players for the demands of the game come a Saturday or a Wednesday afternoon. Next slide, please, Brett. And just to finish off on this introduction, from these game demands, we can start to consider how we influence the physical, the technical, the psychological elements in training throughout the week. And I use something that my colleague Chris Lowe first introduced me to from gymnastics, which was from the Eastern Bloc, actually, the USSR, back in the 80s. And they talked about this idea of surplus, where gymnasts would repeat routines over and over again in one go, so that when it came to competition, it would be simple. And from there, kind of came up with this slider analogy, where if we have a mean understanding or an average understanding of the game demands, we can slide the physical, technical, and tactical up and down to better prepare the players for competition throughout the week.
Evening, folks. I'm going to take you through the game demands that Mike just talked about for the players and for the coaches to better understand what the game is about. And I believe that the coaches and the players need to know what the game is actually about. So looking at the adult game and the age grade game, most of this data is taken from World Rugby, Six Nations, and the analysis department in Leinster. The game is around 60% unstructured play, which means unstructured is from turnover, from the opposition kicking you the ball, and that sort of not planned for chaos sort of game. Whereas 40% is in around that structured, where it comes from lineouts and scrums. With that in mind, the attack roughly has about 51 possessions in the whole game. So that's 51 times that they can actually attack from. For the schoolboy game, is 70 minutes, or it's 10 minutes shorter. They have about 42 possessions in total. For the set pieces, lineouts and scrums, there's only 8 scrums in the adult game. Now they can plus and minus. Sometimes it's lower, sometimes it's higher because of the nature of the game. For the schoolboy game, it's 11, and for the women's game, it's 9. Lineouts, 11 for the adult game, 8 for the schoolboy game, and 7 for the women's game. So you can see the beginning, that sort of information for a coach can begin to form what training is about or how you should start structuring training. The most common activity is in around that contact area. So the rucks per game is between 80 to 100 rucks per game for the adults, 75 to 90 for schoolboy. Women's game has a lot more rucks. There's a lot more tackles. I'll show you the defense side of things in a second. But they have about 120 rucks per game. I spoke about unstructured play. In the transition attack to defense, roughly you're looking at about 22 times the opposition is going to kick you the ball, depending on the game, and 15 from turnovers where the opposition have either knocked the ball on or you've won the ball in the tackle area. So a majority of our possessions are coming from that transition from attack to defense. In terms of tries scored, again, most of the tries in all grades, in the women's game, in the under 18 age grade game, and the senior adult game, the majority is coming from transition play, such as those kicks and turnovers that we spoke about. Less than 35% is coming from scrums or from lineouts. So the rest is made up of either quick taps or scrum attack, that sort of area. 60% of all tries are scored within the first 4 phases for the schoolboy game. And this data is presented all around the world, and it's more or less the same per game for the men's and women's game. In terms of defense, roughly you'll have 49 times you'll have to defend. The school game is 40. In terms of tackles, the average game is around 106 tackles. For the schoolboy game, sitting at around 78. Women's game, and this data is taken from this year's Six Nations, is very, very high. It's double what the schoolboys are producing at the moment. So there's around 150 to 170 tackles. And one of their games, one of the teams had over 200 tackles in the game. And then lastly, the transition is 20 from kicks and turnovers. So you've got to try and defend once you kick the ball, or you've got to try and defend after you turn over the ball. So all of that information should start to formulate in your head what training is going to be about.
Brett, can I ask a question? We've had a couple of questions through. So I just thought, are there any sort of the sources of that data at all? Are there any references that we can guide people to?
Yeah, I'll send on all the references. The references are bottom left hand of the screen. Hopefully people can see it. That structured attack comes from John McKee and Donna O'Connor down in Australia, which is based on Super Rugby. The rest is all available in the World Rugby site, the World Rugby analysis site. But I can definitely forward on after this with the presentation all of these papers. No problem with that.
Excellent, thank you.
Then looking at in terms of training, Paddy Phillips is a fitness advisor within Leinster. He studied in Leeds Beckett. He's a PhD. He looked into the exposure of match play preparation in the adolescent, schoolboy and academy game. He tried to compare both of them. What his findings were schoolboy backs were underprepared for all movement demands. So they were unprepared for the volume of work, the speeds, the walking, the running, the sprinting, the jogging. For the forwards, they were underprepared for the low intensity activities. However, looking at the academy forwards that he looked at for his study, they were exposed to similar physical demands for training to matches, and their backs were similar, or if not exceeding the values. So the value of probably more experienced coaches working in that academy setting than the schoolboy setting was able to match the intensities of each game. Jason?
Yeah, thanks, Brett. So just to follow on from what you were saying there, and to share with everyone watching and listening out there, those results from Paddy's research they are very typical. Wherever we look at the training demands, we find that we are struggling to simulate match intensity in training, which is a problem because most of us are time poor in our environments. So we don't have as much time as we'd potentially want with our players, and there's a lot of things we want to do. We want to get fit, we want to get better at our skills, we want to execute our tactical plays better, and so that causes problems. And part of the reason why maybe we're sharing the ideas around tactical periodization is that to some extent we think that this is an approach that can help with that time poorness. So think back to the previous slide where Brett showed you that that in some environments it's difficult to simulate the demands of training. And then what this is some unpublished data from an international sevens team, and essentially the red bar is match demands, and these are peak demands. So it's if you had a look at the most challenging 30 seconds in the game, you can see that that's sitting somewhere at around 220 meters a minute. If you had a look at the most challenging 3 minutes in the game, you can see that's around 120 meters a minute. And then what we've got laid on top of that is a couple of different training types that are based on the tactical periodization approach. And what you can see from this is that we are either completely replicating match demands in terms of distance run, or we are in fact overloading and exceeding. We're creating that sort of surplus that Mike talked about. So this particular slide is just a very rough metric. It's looking at total distance. But Brett, if you jump across to the next one, what you see here is we're now looking at a couple of different metrics. So for anyone who's not too familiar with this type of forest plot, the gray bar in the middle essentially represents match demand. So if any dot occurs within that gray bar, it means that it's replicating the match demands, give or take a little bit. And what you can see, just working from left to right, is that the volume and the quality or the intensity type training are very, very good at replicating match demands. And then towards the right-hand side of the screen, what we're showing there is that by changing the session constraints somewhat, sometimes you can overemphasize some things, you can create surplus or overload in some areas, but that often has the effect of reducing the load in other areas. So, for example, the third one across is a training session focused on maximum velocity and high-speed running, and you can see that that's right at the top of the match demands, but as a result of focus on that, we've gotten less acceleration or distance or tackles in that session. And then the one on the far right hand side is just showing us that if we do a session focused on collisions or tackling, we're very likely to simulate the collision demands of the game, but then right at the bottom there, we've not created any maximum speed stimulus. So it's really just to paint a picture about how we can start thinking about manipulating variables within training while we're practicing our tactical skill to try and get closer to some of those physical demands that we're trying to prepare the players for.
Michael, any questions at this stage?
Yeah, no, it's just one that's come through from Liam Dunseth. And Liam, thank you. It's a really good one to interject with. So when we're looking at the opposition average, so from whistle to whistle duration, and then trying to replicate that in training. So are we looking at any overload in terms of time duration? So for example, 60 seconds. So we actually need to train for 72-second blocks. Is it simple enough to add 20% extra time into how we into the duration in terms of our coaching?
I'll have a go at answering that if that's all right, Michael.
Yep.
So I think that myself personally, I probably wouldn't get too hung up on what the opposition are able to do, because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is physiological systems that underpin these physical performances. So, if you're going to go all out for 72 seconds, we know that that's going to be, an ATP PC system followed by the anaerobic system and a big aerobic contribution. And I mean, without getting too technical, those systems can't tell the difference between 60 and 72 seconds. operationally, what happens when I'm training like this is we'd have an idea about what sort of stimulus we're going for. We'd know that on average the ball is in play maybe 30 or 40 seconds, but we'll know also that at times it exceeds that. So generally, we'd start with the plan in mind and say, okay, if this is a quality focused session, then we're going to work towards those smaller time periods, but we'll see how it evolves, because when we're working with humans, sometimes we're planning for a play to carry on for 45 seconds and they drop it on the second pass, and then it's about thinking on your feet a little bit. If you want to get that stimulus, then you move to what Brett was saying about the unstructured play, and you throw a ball out or you kick a ball or something, and you just keep the ball in play. You just keep people reacting and doing things. And also, what I'd also do is, even within a session where we know that we may be working on the shorter time periods in the scale, we might throw a long one out there just, because people have got to be able to react. They've got to be able to adapt in the game. It's no good they switch off after 30 or 45 seconds. So Liam, I don't know if that's answered your question. I hope I haven't missed the point, but for me, I'd be working towards what I feel my team needs to be stimulated by, not by the averages produced by other teams.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that.
I think we're going to jump in, and hopefully some of this might answer Liam's question. If we take that the match duration is 80 minutes for the adult game, and for the underage game it is 70 minutes, obviously, the actual ball in play time is actually only 37 minutes. So for half of that time, or less than half of that time, the ball is actually on the pitch. So there's an awful lot of downtime for that's going on between the game. Of that 37 minutes, you're only ever in attack roughly 17 minutes, in defense roughly 15. If you're having a really bad day, that 15 minutes in defense is nearly 20. And in terms of attack is actually much lower. You might only have the ball for 9 or 10 minutes. So that data changes as we go along, depending on what type of game is going on. The average passage of play is less than 30 seconds. Now, with the nature of our game, we don't have a definitive endpoint. The endpoint is based around the skills of the player and the understanding of referees and their understanding of laws. We can't say that a passage of play is going to go on for longer and longer. Killian Reardon, who works with the senior team in Leinster, has done studies on what he terms the worst case scenario. So the worst case scenario is the longest passage of play that the ball is on the pitch for. And he's looking at about 152 seconds, which is over 2 minutes, up to 171 seconds. Actually, the 171 seconds is my research from referees around the All-Ireland League. And so we've got to prepare our players for all of these situations, whether it be averages of 30 seconds or right up to that worst case scenario of 152 to 171 seconds. But I think you've got to interlink that with your training sessions. I don't believe you should just go with 30 seconds because that's the average, because you might have to hold on to the ball for a hell of a lot longer than that. In terms of running demands, I know we spoke about the physical nature of the game. For an 80-minute game, roughly the high-end players are covering around 7 kilometers, so 7,000 meters, and it can drop down to about 5.5. For the schoolboy and the women's game, it's around 5K, so 5,000 meters. University games are slightly less, according to the research coming out of Leeds Beckett. One metric we look at is relative distance. So that's the amount of meters you cover within a minute. So the average game is sitting at around plus or minus 7.6. It's sitting at around 69 meters per minute. Obviously, the age grade game drops to 65. Women's game is sitting at 54. And again, I can forward on some of these studies at the end with the presentation if you want. The references are down on the bottom left-hand side. So this is what's going on in terms of the physical nature of the game. In terms of the tactical, technical points of the game, the adult game ball carries are 9 plus or minus 8, and for the schoolboy game it's 6. So that's 6 times they're carrying the ball into contact. The ruck involvements, so whether it be taking the ball into contact and clearing out rucks, is sitting at around 26 times. And for the schoolboy game, it's 14 tackles, 9 for the adult game, and 6 for the schoolboy game. With that data, that's whole team averages. So we got to remember our forwards will probably carry more and the backs less. The ruck involvements for a forward is greater than a back, and the tackles, because they're closer to the contact areas. So that data is there. For the adult or for the age grade game, it is actually just lower because they're playing the game 10 minutes less. So it's looking at 7 ruck or ball carries, ruck involvements about 18, and tackles is around 6. Looking at the speed, and all this data is telling us that our game is it's an intermittent sport. There's bouts of high intensity and low intensity, high speeds, low speed. But 72 to 81% of our game is actually low activity. So it's walking. Now, this is not ball and play time. This is over the duration of 80 minutes. So if you actually stop and think about it, when the forwards are winning a line out, the outside backs are repositioning, and most of the time it's walking. In terms of the passages play in between the passages or the ball and play time, they are walking to the line out, walking to the scrum. Low speed running, jogging roughly takes up about 18% of our game. High speed running is about 2%. And depending on the position, sprinting, an outside back is only sprinting 1 sprint every 7 minutes. And for the forward, it's actually double that. It's about 14. And I know that's some of Jason's research. I'd say you wouldn't mind sharing that with the slides. Jason? No?
Sure, no problem.
Okay. Moving on to the actual passage of play. So we go back to the game averages of that 30 seconds. Roughly the relative distance is around 108. Collisions is sitting at 1, and the accelerations over 3 meters per second is sitting at about 1. High speed running is about 15 meters. If we look at the averages, so that's 60 to 90 seconds, the relative distance is similar to what the 30 to 60 second game is. Accelerations, they will have 1 extra acceleration, and they'll do 1 more collision. In the worst case scenario, what Killian is saying, all the metrics go up. The total distance covered is around 300 meters. Accelerations are go to 2. Collisions goes up to 1. High speed running is a lot more. So once the ball is in play, those metrics start to go up. And I know this is physical data, but we as coaches have got to have this understanding for this sort of information, because this will then help to design our training sessions.
Brett,
Yep.
That's great. And I think you provided a really clear rationale of why we need to understand that. Just some of the questions that have come in have been focused around that, particularly around, I guess there's an argument whereby, if the ball is not in play for that long, should we be trying to develop more skillful players who don't lose the ball? And I guess a question from Jonathan Sharkey, I think summarises it quite well when he talks about a club coach at an amateur level. Should they be focused on the physical demands for the majority of the session due to the lack of training time with the players that they have each week, and a focus on individual skills when fatigue has been introduced? So I guess we try and then create a more of a positive adaptation after the training session or the physical work has been done, so to speak. What are the panelists' thoughts on that?
I think for me, to adopt a true tactical periodisation approach, the attempt is to try and target all 3 of those. Is to try and work under fatigue whilst developing skill and developing physical ability under a tactical framework. Obviously, that sounds very idealistic, but that is the approach that we're trying to get across here, is that if we can better plan and shape our intentions around the capabilities that we need for the game, then hopefully all of those capabilities are going to improve. Jason, Brett, I don't know if you got anything to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, this is the idea. We're trying to deal with all of these things at once, because we get taught about sport in silos, but it doesn't work like that. We can't run a rugby practice where you go first to the strength and conditioning coach and you run around the field a bunch of times. Then you go to the skills coach and you practice passing. Then you go to the head coach and he draws some stuff on the board so that you understand your tactics. And then you go to the mental coach and he tells you how to deal with pressure. It doesn't work like that. So what we've got to do is we got to understand that at the end of the day, you win by playing better than the opposition. Okay, you win by executing your skills and your tactics better than the opposition under pressure. And for me as a strength and conditioning coach, that's quite a tough realization to come to, because what you're saying is that what you do is important, but it's actually not that important. Because I've coached plenty of guys that are awful in the gym, but they're incredible rugby players and they make a difference on the pitch. And if you bring across this physical Adonis that can't play or can't combine with the rest of the players, it really doesn't matter that much. So that's where the tactical periodization idea of the tactical outcomes being chief and everything fitting in below that to support that becomes the most important. And just I'm off on a bit of a tangent here, but I mentioned earlier that everyone's time poor. Now, if you're as a strength and conditioning coach sitting there and your team trains twice a week and you're trying to get them fit and you're begging for time from the coach and you're saying, oh, but coach, you only gave me 15 minutes and I need 20. You're never gonna make a major change to the guys' performance outcomes like that. But if you're sitting down with the coach and saying, okay, coach, what do we need to do this week? What's the tactical outcome that you need? And he goes, well, we got to get better at our defense on the short side. And you go, okay, coach, why don't we set up the session like this? Because we can achieve that tactical goal of defending on the short side, but we can also get some really great physical stimulus in there by manipulating a couple of things, whether that's space or time or whatever it is. Then we start creating a partnership and the players benefit.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. I think that's probably answered a few questions. Sorry, Brett.
No, you're fine. And hopefully the slides in the next while, when we go through the actual practical, what does the training session look like? Yeah. Hopefully that will answer Jonathan's question and other questions out there.
Yeah, just to just to pre-warn Mike, Brett, and Jason, there'll be some questions coming through around RPEs and how we might integrate those if we obviously haven't got access to some GPS.
Okay, looking at how we're going to practically train tactical periodization for rugby sessions, what Jason and Mike have proposed within their research is looking at 4 different types of training sessions. So the first training session, and we have video to show what these sessions look like, is a non-contact work capacity session. And I'll go through the information on these sessions, on the training goals of these sessions as we go along. The second session is a contact acceleration deceleration session, so that it's a lot more contact based. And then there's the speed session. When you use the word speed session, straight away people will think it's a fitness session. It's not. It's the speed of the session and the speed of movement of your players, where they're actually working their tactical, technical, and physical and mental part of the game. And the last session is an active recovery session. So what do those sessions look like? So with the non-contact work capacity session, the training goal is to develop endurance capacity. So running intensities and volumes are greater than the match play. So the information that we've already presented on match play, we're looking to override that and increase that volume. With this particular session, there's no contact. It's going to be in a large group, so 10 versus 10, 15 versus 15. You can overload the attack, overload the defense, whatever way you're going to do it. Playing area, mid-pitch, full-size pitch. The interval time is between 20 and 30 minutes with a complete recovery or an 5 to 8 minute recovery, which will be around the complete recovery. Intervals, 1, numbers of sets, 1 and 3. Jason, have you got anything to add on that one?
No, I think you've summed it up well. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. I am aware I'm presenting an awful lot of your work. So what do those sessions look like? So what we're going to do is we're just going to look at about 2 minutes of video footage taken from, I think it's Leinster under-19s. So this session was looking at transition, defence to attack. The mental part of it is decision making under fatigue, concentration. We're looking at high relative distance. So the relative distance should be around the 100-metre mark. We're looking at kick, chase, tactical, technical, and the repositioning of the team once they go from defence to attack. Oh, sorry, I'm playing the video. Okay, so the game starts with a box kick. Okay, so instantly you can see a transition coming. Okay, now we have a second transition. So they've actually ended up getting the ball back. Okay, so turnover. You notice that a turnover happens, the game doesn't stop. So the coach has actually just reloaded rucks on either side of just outside the 22s. So all that's designed to do is to keep that relative distance high. Again, working on that mental capacity of trying to fatigue the players. Again, because this particular activity is working on transition defense to attack, here's the transition going in. So there is a constraint for this particular activity because it's what they were trying to work on. So the transition comes in. Okay, kick to the corner. Instead of playing the line out, players are going to go the other opposite side of the field. So again, this is to keep that physical nature of the game. Keep it high. And again, the game is going to start with this transition defense to attack in mind. Okay, there's another error here. It's kicked out on the full, but again, the game doesn't stop. We want the players to overload the physical part of the meters covered within that seconds, within this session. So we're keeping the players moving all the time. The second session that's been proposed here in
Brett, sorry. If I could just jump in with a quick comment there. You were talking about those worst case scenarios, the longest ball in play time and things like that. And what that type of session that you just showed there is particularly useful for is preparing people for those. Now, we know they don't happen often. Those numbers that you showed are based on the longest passage of play in a game. But if you do a training session like what you've just done, and you've carried that on for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, guys will be more than conditioned to be able to deal with those worst case passages of play.
The second session that's been put out is a contact acceleration deceleration session. So this session is high density contact. There's a lot more tackles, a lot more rucks. There's still acceleration and deceleration parts of the game. So this is to try and replicate this contact area. The group size is smaller. Playing area is small because we do want them to have contact. The interval time is 60 to 120 seconds. So in around that 2 minute with about a 1 minute recovery. So we're trying to match that above average part of the game. So what does this look like? So this is taken from the Leinster Schools team. So it is a defense session. So we are looking at defense. There is a transition involved because we've left it quite live. The mental parts of the game, we're looking at their decision making. We have a bit of a call saying get the ball back. So we're looking at this here. High contact content, the tactical, technical, pressure on the attack via line speed. And we're also looking at a two-man tackle to try and slow the ball down. So what does that look like? So we have 3 teams. The constraint is the ball carrier must take contact straight away. Okay, so there's a transition. Okay, passage of play is around 27 seconds. However, we just try and keep them moving with giving them around a 30-second break on that one. So it's a pretty condensed area they're playing in. We don't let them go to full field because we actually do want to put them through that contact situations. And this is probably one of our first training sessions of the season.
Brett, can I just jump in here if that's okay?
Yep.
This is just a real nice example where you can reattach to that Launder quote, which is, what is tactically desirable must be technically possible. For every tactical attempt here of a two-man tackle or a turnover, there has to be an efficient technique reinforced in there. And that's really where little moments of feedback can be pushed in from the coach as this is going along. And because it is so intermittent in the nature of this, so 30 seconds on, you've got plenty and ample opportunity to be engaging and feeding back with your coach behaviours. I just think it's a nice example there.
Yeah. So you can see they're the 4 areas that we're trying to work on with the players, and it is within one activity. So you can begin to see tactical periodization on the model that's been put forward by Jason and Mike here. The third session is the speed session. So we're looking at the game with a higher amount of speed, and it's speed of decision making, speed of movement, and tactical execution. There is some contact involved, but not a whole lot, because we would have done the contact in that last session. Group size 10 versus 7, so there is an overload of attack and defense. Medium pitch, interval times are dropped, so they're sitting at around 30 seconds to 60 seconds. Recoveries should be quite high, so we want them all the time to think of keeping the game nice and high. So this is another transition defense to attack, so we're working on this. Physical part is the accelerations, decelerations. Mental goes decision making, concentration again. There's a kick chase defense nature to tactical technical, and there's a reposition of the team in attack and defense. So this one here, smaller area than before. So the intensity of this particular game is a lot higher than the last one. We let them play through the transition, even if there's errors. Okay, so now there's time. They stop. This is their recovery time. So there's a bit of a chat with the coaches. They can have a discussion. Then we go straight back in once we finish with that 60-second break. So again, because this particular session is transition defense to attack, there's the transition. There's low contact. So it's more of a grab and hold. So again, you can see the 4 areas that we're trying to work on within that training session. The last training session is an active recovery session. So it's similar to a match intensity, but it is probably quite low. Most people would maybe run their team sessions or their team run sessions, their last session before a match, similar to this. So again, a shorter period of time. It is the larger group because we want 15 versus 8. So that might be your starting 15 versus your eight substitutes. Medium size to large side game. Interval time, we'll keep it at 2 and 3. Recovery 60 seconds. Intervals quite low. So what does that look like? So this is an attack versus defense. Below match intensity, we are looking at decision making, passing and support, and we're trying to get the players to hold some width here on this one. So we start with just those 4 ruck pads across. So that's their point of start. Again, there's limited contact within it. If it's pre-game, it's more of a grab and hold sort of activity. So that's roughly the activity that we would do for that sort of part of the training week.
Brett,
Yep.
first of all, I'd really like to say thank you for sharing those clips with us, because not many clubs would, particularly within soccer, would do that. So thank you for sharing and giving us that insight, and there's some really good practical examples to take away that again provides a justification for what we're talking about. We've had loads of questions coming in. Some we'll deal with around the mental side of the game and RPEs maybe later on as we work our way through. So a few questions have come in around also around coaches' knowledge and understanding, and the type of coach and the learning experiences they need in terms of implementing this model. And again, maybe we'll finish with those. But I guess when we're using this tactical periodization approach, I guess it does align itself fairly succinctly with maybe teaching games for understanding or constraints-led approach, using some of those principles of representation. Be good to get your thoughts on that, Mike, Brett, and Jason.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in here. Really, I guess this kind of aligns to my PhD research around the idea of what representation actually looks like, representative practice design. I think the moments of the game, or the principles of the game, or problems, as I said earlier, give you an attempt to understand what representative should look like. So sometimes representativeness can just be understood as a whole game. So we're just going to play the game. Whereas from my perspective, we should be trying to represent the particular moment of the game that we're targeting. So if we're trying to work on line breaks through the center of the pitch, then so off a fly half, we want to really reinforce that moment over and over again. So we then design our practice to make sure that decision, that moment, is frequently repetitive. And that might be in a single phase in a game or through multi-phase. So I think representativeness is very much particular to the demand of the moment of the game rather than the game as a whole.
Okay, brilliant. Cheers for that, Mike. Anything you'd like to add on to that, Brett or Jason?
On Jay.
No, I mean, look, Mike's the expert in this area, and I think he's summed it up quite well. Not a great deal I can add to that.
And Brett, just a question for you, I think, from Nick Hill. In terms of those video that you've shown, what were the principles of play that they were working on in each of those examples? Were they just fitting the data into? Were those examples to fit to represent the data that you were showing?
Yeah,
by the way.
Yeah, those video clips were used to fit what those training sessions looked like. Okay. So, for example, if we take that defensive session and that which was a Leinster under-18 session, we would have done something similar to that training session, Andy Skeen and myself, for our first year in charge of the team, and we put the GPS vests on the players, and we found out that particular activity that we were doing was nowhere near what was needed for a particular match for matches. So we ended up tweaking that the players had to run a bit more, and we had to increase the contact by saying, well, the first ball carry had to be a contact, even though our philosophy wouldn't be that. So we had to try and come up with an activity that would match what was actually going on in the game, and then we'd row it back. So they originally started in the middle of the pitch, but then we started them on the side. So it's probably a good example of us using our knowledge, our rugby knowledge, to actually match what the fitness guys were telling us. And we had to tweak our training because of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Brett, because I think at its simplest form, this can be misinterpreted as, oh, well, this is just game-based training. We'll just play games all the time. And yeah, we want players in games all the time, but we want them in very particular situations within the game so that they can have the opportunity to execute the skills and make the decisions that they're going to be afforded in the game, so that they can do those better when those opportunities present themselves. It's not random. It's in fact, there's a lot of thought that goes into trying to make it as similar to those game situations as possible.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jason. We're just going to pause very quickly for a water break, just to provide some sort of context. In the UK, every Thursday evening, people are going outside onto the roads, not physically onto the roads, but onto the pavements, or at their front door to clap for the NHS. So those of you who wish to do that, we'll give you 2 minutes. I'll also probably suggest it's a good time to grab a glass of water and come back. We've got probably around about 15-20 minutes left with some plus questions and answers. So we'll break for 2 minutes now, and we'll see you at 2 minutes past 8. Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you managed to grab a cup of tea and stretch the legs. I definitely know after these sort of 2 months of lockdown in the UK, I'm going to need a new back and hips after this. So if anyone knows a good surgeon, if they could send me his or her details, that would be much appreciated. Just to sort of summarise some of the questions that have come in. We will be talking about vertical and horizontal training weeks in a few moments, so we'll cover those. There'll be work that Mike and Jason have done in that area. There's a question here from Stephen Phillips, and I must admit I don't know the answer to this, but how does this approach compare or differ to the tactical morphocycle described by Fergus Connolly in Game Changer? I don't know if any of you guys have come across that. Has that one stumped us?
Yeah, I've started reading Game Changer. I'm afraid I'm not there yet. Okay. So apologies, Stephen, for not being able to answer that one. And there's some more coming in, definitely around maybe the amateur and grassroots game and how we can again embed this approach in that setting. So we'll pick that up, as well as the embedding sort of psychological skills and coach knowledge towards the end. So I'll hand back to you guys to continue, if that's okay.
Yeah, I was going to look about what does this look like on a training week. The majority of the research around this area is in Portuguese, and the translations for this research get a bit blurred in translation. So what they speak about is the principle of horizontal alteration and specificity. However, it is essentially the weekly schedule. What does it actually look like for us? So to quote Jason, training activities to emphasize the development of different physical and tactical abilities throughout the training week. So what the training week is going to look like is, have we actually touched on that physical, on that tactical, the abilities? Does it actually touch it? We believe these sessions do. So the weekly schedule, if we take it that we go match to match, Saturday to Saturday, and we had 4 training sessions for that particular week. Now, straight away, people are going to say, well, we only train Tuesday, Thursday. We do have a model for that coming up next. But for the school teams out there, the higher end schools, they are probably training 4 times a week. So what it looks like for a Sunday is complete rest. The players, because we play a contact sport, they've got to have their recovery time. And it's not only the physical recovery, it's actually the mental recovery of a game as well. So we go with complete rest. The second, or the Monday, which is going to be the first day of the week, sort of activity, will be that sub-maximum work capacity that we just showed. So it's that capacity where the ball is in play longer. There's a lot more running, but the running is lower intensity. There's no contact. And it's designed like that because of the physical nature of what went on 48 hours beforehand. Moving into the Tuesday part of the session will be the acceleration, deceleration, contact set part of the week. So that was a time where we can start to ramp up the activity, where the players should be recovered, so that they can start that physical nature of the game. Wednesday goes to complete rest. Again, we are recovering from what went on Tuesday. So we're looking at a 24-hour rest period there. Moving into Thursday will be where that speed session will come in. So after a time of rest, where the players hopefully will have recovered. Friday, we're into that active recovery phase, where they are recovering from the training load of the week, but they're also preparing for what's happening the following day, which is the match. And then we'll work on that cycle again. Jason, anything on that particular one?
Yeah, probably just to also address some of the questions I see coming through. You know, one of the biggest challenges with training rugby players is this necessity to engage in contact and collisions in the game. Now, we have to do it in training, because if we don't do it in training, we're never prepared for doing it in matches, and there's no opportunity to improve our skill or our technique in that aspect of the game. So there's got to be a contact exposure during the week. What we also know is that contact exposure is particularly damaging, and it takes time to recover from that. In fact, you know, it may take longer than 48 hours, but we don't have that much time in a week. So, you know, for those, because I see a few questions coming through with different people on variations and how would you fit it into this type of week or that type of week. For me, the first principle would be to work out when you're going to do your contact training in a week, and how far can you get that away from your match exposure, so that it's kind of like in weightlifting, they used to do the old 3-day split. You try and keep those stimulus as far away from each other as possible, so that you can get maximum recovery from that, and then you build the other sessions in around that. But hopefully that'll become clearer as you move on to your next slide.
I also think, Jason, I think at this stage, I think we have to become a bit more individual. So if you have a player who's had a high volume of contact, who is fatigued, and your markers are telling you this, I would be then reluctant to throw him back in on the Tuesday, or control it or reduce it. So I think I definitely don't think it's a one size fits all. And we have to base it around the individual. And you'll know who those individuals are, whether it be a back rower who's made 25 tackles in the match, and you know he's mentally and physically fatigued and he hasn't recovered. Those older players that you might have in your team, they might need extra time to recover. So they might actually do, well, hold on, we only played on Saturday. He's already done that contact for the week. So we can actually drop those training that part of the training session for that particular individual. If that makes sense, Jason.
Yeah, agreed.
Looking at Tuesday, Thursday, so again, match Saturday. So this would be probably a bit more of a model that we would have in terms of club rugby in Ireland. Again, the complete rest comes after the match. In terms of the Monday, so we are still looking at doing sub-max intensity sort of work. That can be gym-based. However, some of that training session might feature in the Tuesday training session. So it might be part of the warm-up. It might be a 15-minute or a 10-minute part of the warm-up where you can incorporate what is in the last model on the Monday, or depending on what the structure is or what you have within your club, I would probably look at moving to a gym-based program. Jason?
Yeah, absolutely. We're like I say, we time poor, but we want the fittest players we can have. So whatever training stimulus we can get into them, we should get into them.
So again, Wednesday becomes a complete rest after the contacts of the night before, and then we're into that speed part of that particular Thursday, where we are then thinking of the Friday session inching in. So you are on that team run, last 10 minutes of training sort of activity, but you are looking to increase the speed. The players should be rested from that Saturday. So that is how that model will work for that Tuesday, Thursday nights. Jason.
Yeah, so really what this part of the presentation is about is we've been talking about how to try and get these different stimulus into players. And so what this now comes down to is the nuts and bolts of how do we actually do it? How do you plan your session? What constraints can you imply or impose on the game to create these changes? And this is probably just a useful checklist for coaches. I'm sure most coaches are using some or all of these. But if we want to try and influence these different demands of the game, and I'm talking not just physical here, but tactical also. And Mike, jump in whenever you feel you need to. The things we can do is have a look at game constraints, things like numbers in the ruck. If we need to create more space to create more opportunity for attack, and that may in fact lead to more high-speed running because the attackers are breaking the line more often. We can do that by forcing the defense to put 5 in a ruck and the attack only has to put 1. We can talk about different ruck and tackle behaviors. Do you have to go down to the floor? Do you have to go to a knee? Do you have to hold people into the ruck? Or can we just touch each other with 2 hands and get back into play? That changes the game situation. Contact level, are we just grabbing and holding, or are we smashing each other? Obviously with proper warm-ups and under the correct conditions. Affecting things like player numbers. Are we overloading the attack? Are we overloading the defense? Overloading the attack, giving them more numbers creates more opportunities for them and makes the defenders run hell for leather. On the other hand, if you want people to make tackles, just don't give the attackers as much numbers. That they don't have any space, they've got nowhere to go to, so they just have to keep running into defenders over and over again, and that grows our collision demands. We can shrink or increase the size of the field to put players closer together and increase collision, or create more space to influence running. Where they're playing on the field, when you start attacking in the 22, there's no backfield to worry about, so the defense tends to get up a lot close on you. Whereas if you're attacking from the halfway line, there's more space to defend, and so that changes the constraints also. A really powerful stimulus here, and we got onto it a bit before, is how much ball and play time versus how much recovery time. If you want to get that volume type stimulus, if you want to get the guys' heart rates up and get them working and sweating, you probably want the ball and play more. But if you want to emphasize high speed running, if you want to emphasize execution, you said earlier, Brett, that most most teams score within 4 phases, or else they don't score at all. So, if we're talking about short ball in play times and saying, well, this is your opportunity to execute, we're going to give you some chances and you need to go and score, that plays within that sort of short ball in play time type of scenario. And then, the last thing to talk about is just thinking whatever constraints that you put on the game, the way the coach behaves also changes the levels of pressure, the mental attunement of the players, things like that. If we're in a learning phase and the coach is saying, well, that's all right, boys, you've dropped the ball for the 19th time in a row, but it's okay. We're learning, we're building towards something. That's very different from an execution type session where the coach is going to start losing his rag if things aren't happening the way they need to. And that's also important because, in a game, you've got to score when you've got to score. So, putting that pressure and creating that mental environment where you have to score at this opportunity is also useful at times. Mike, I ran through the whole list, but do you want to jump in there?
No, I think it's quite a nice time to go on to the next slide, which is you've presented pretty much all the considerations that a coach has to go through when they're designing their practice. And it's a bit of a minefield, to be honest. We're proposing a holistic approach to developing a tactical model, whilst also considering the psychological, the physical, and the technical capabilities that are required. And I think I see a lot of things thrown around on Twitter around, I've got this really good game, or like this really good game that we're going to use. And I think it's great that we're using game-based practice, but I would start a step before, and I'm a massive advocate. He's a colleague of mine, of Bob Muir, and the coach plan and reflective framework, because again, it starts with the end in mind. It's that Steve Covey idea. What are we actually trying to achieve here? And what I mean by that is, if we can start to think in game moments or game problems, then our session objective or learning objective or outcome for that session can be centralized around that particular game moment or that particular principle. And then we start to consider what capabilities start to fall under that. And then what is required within that practice to allow improvements to occur. I'm just going to attach on to Baum's characteristics of learning outcomes here. And he talks about it being active, attractive, appropriate, attainable. And if we've gone through the right process and coming up with an appropriate game model, they should tick all those boxes anyway. But the two I want to focus on are being measurable and visible. And I think this is really going to challenge some a coach's bias, basically, because sometimes, me included, we can look at a session and we think that session's been successful because one player's just done something amazingly well. How often do we actually go about setting up a measurable learning outcome that we come back to at the end and actually have a tangible measure of success? And also, when we start with the end in mind, we can design a practice, as Brett showed before with those videos, and we can also plan for specific interactions. Some people may have been on Ed Hall's webinar earlier this year, and he spoke about that we need to plan for interactions with players, and I think that's really important through our coach behaviours. And I just think this is a really nice idea. Start with the game moment, then consider what you really want to achieve within that game moment or that performance problem, and then design the practice and plan for behaviours to allow the players to then engage with those objectives as well.
Guys, just to jump in with some questions there. Thank you for Martin. That's a really good tool to use and almost embed it in actually a planning framework that you might use prior to planning your sessions. We've had lots of questions coming around. I guess flipping back to some of those, if we can go back to the previous slide, Brett, if that's okay. Brett, you're doing a fantastic job there. Thank you. Sorry, as a slide master. Just in terms, and Jason, you spoke about recovery time, but there's been some questions that have come in, I guess, more so on the actual recovery of players, whether we're coaching once a week or 3 times a week plus a game. So if we could just maybe answer some of those. One is around the amount of contact, and when we talk about contact, what's the definition of that? Does it always have to be full contact to develop the technical demands of the game? And then secondly, around how might we begin to measure fatigue post session? What sort of tools have you come across to use that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the contact one is a challenge. And what we've got to realize is that with players playing at different levels, we've got to think about what's our role there. Are we trying to develop them, or are we just trying to get them ready for the following week? And Brett made a really important point, because, you know, if you're an international loose forward and you've just made 15 or 16 tackles and you've carried the ball into contact 10 times and you've hit 15 rucks, you probably gotten enough contact in your life for that week, you know. On the other hand, if you're a schoolboy player and you know, potentially you've come off the bench, or maybe you have played the whole game, but you've made 8 tackles in the game, you know, and you've got you know, aspirations to play at a higher level, you know, you've got to improve that part of your game somewhere, and we don't improve without practicing. So, you know, it's context specific. I saw one of the comments came through and said that the England team take 2 days off after their game. That's actually quite common in a lot of international teams. But, you know, these guys are at the pinnacle of rugby, and it's war out there. It's attrition. I'm not surprised it takes them 2 days to recover. You know, so this is a guideline. It's a tool. You know, no one's saying that you know, go and plan your week exactly like this. I think the more important thing is to realize that, you know, the game presents some physical challenges. One of those is, we know that expressions of maximal speed usually make the difference. Okay, so if you're not getting an opportunity to sprint maximally in a week, you're not getting better at that aspect of your game. And we know that the ability to dominate collisions, to tackle well, things like that are also very important for the game. So we've got to find places in our week where we can overload those aspects so that we can develop in them.
I think for me, just on the tackle, I think it's a really important part of training, is that, one, we need to prevent injury, and 2, we need to embrace variability in training activities. So whilst we need to match or have surplus of game demands, we also need to consider the different nature of tackles that are occurring. So that also has a massive impact on our practice design. So if we use a narrow pitch and we're only doing 5v5, but the emphasis is on our tackle, the likelihood is the majority of those tackles are going to be front on, which might not be good for an outside back. So all I'm saying is that we need to embrace the variability in our practice design to ensure that we're meeting the demands positionally as well as collectively.
Thanks for that. And just sort of, I guess this is a really one that summarises that contact issue. One of I might change my name to this, anonymous attendee. I think that would be a great name to have. Talks about how a coach who used to coach one of his high-level under-20 side, where they wouldn't have contact, and they would only do contact on break weeks where they had no game coming up, and he or she suggests that the injury rate for the season was very low and they had a very successful year. I mean, how much would you agree or disagree with that approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's contextual. I think that one of the things we've got to consider is that there are very long seasons in a lot of places these days. I mean, Mike coaching Harrogate, what's your season, about 32 games?
26, I believe, 26 in total.
Okay, 20. So, you know, guys are playing for a very, very long period of time. So it's quite possible, you know, if you've got a relatively short season to not attend to these things. But, you know, when you start getting into this week in, week out, you know, for me, I don't believe you can go 26 weeks without addressing your tackle and your contact technique. I don't think that you're developing players like that. maybe you've got a couple of bye weeks in there and you can have a go. But I think it's if we want players to get better, we've got to give them exposure to situations they can get better in. And we can't guarantee that that's going to happen in the match every week. So, if a person's got a skill deficiency or an area they need to improve, our job as coaches is to create that opportunity.
Thanks, Jason. And just sorry, some of the questions that came through earlier around how we might measure fatigue post-session as well. I know for those who maybe don't have GPS, RPE is a fairly simple tool to use. I know there's now recommendations that you measure internal and external load. So you would measure RPE for the question reads heart and lungs, and then for muscular load as well. So that might be one way to look at it, bearing in mind that I think there's some evidence there around how people's perceptions and of their own score, there needs to be some training to allow them to equate what a 7 is or a 5 is. So that's a fairly simple tool that can be used for those working in schools and clubs who maybe don't have access to GPS. Guys, I know we're coming towards the end, so should we complete the presentation? Then we'll open up to some final questions. I'm conscious of that we're. Oh, there it is. There is the end. The pre-planning, the slides that I have an invisible slide in between, but we've taken that out. Well, there it is. So we will finish there. One thing we didn't cover actually, and I know, Mike, we spoke about it in our previous presentation, was tactical periodisation is a holistic approach, and we touched upon some of the psychological skills that we might embed. And I know there's been a few questions that have come around that. We almost have to have about 4 or 5 different hats on as a coach. And I know we briefly spoke about the psychological characteristics for developing excellence, PCDs, as a possible tool or an approach that we might use embedded within the tactical periodisation approach. Just in terms of some of the questions that have come through on this, can we give us one example, and Brett and Jason, feel free to jump in, of how we might embed some psychological skills within our training design? Yeah,
by all means. I guess psychological skills, characteristics, they are quite relative to particular moments of the game. You would align things like resilience to goal line defence, or goal setting at half time, or in group discussions. And I think you can be really clever and quite deliberate in the way you can target specific psychological skills. So, for example, I'd use self-monitoring or self-evaluation and control, which would cut across both self-regulation and PCDE, so realistic performance evaluation. So I might set an objective for a session where I want us to have, we've got an overload in attack, we're playing off 10, and I want us to achieve 80% success rate of choosing the right option and then executing the right pass. So we go through the session, we have someone with a pen and paper or an analyst if we've got that exposure, and we simply tally up how many attempts, how many successful, how many fail. And then from a realistic performance evaluation point of view, pick out a player, what success rate do you reckon we're at? And then all of a sudden so they're starting to give you their expectations of what the session looks like. And then you provide a realistic evaluation of it for them. Now, little things like that can really reinforce what does real look like? What does performance actually look like here?
That's great, Mike. Thank you for that. Have you anything to add to that, Jason and Brett?
No.
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay, no worries. Thank you for that. I'm really conscious of the time. We're 90 minutes. Now that's a game of football, not rugby. So I'm really happy. I'm comfortable with that duration. So we will begin to close down the webinar now. If there are any more questions, we'll take a few more. But if there are any more questions, if you could send them through now. Just want to reiterate that we've got a really diverse group of people watching this. So again, if we're looking at that training of an amateur team, maybe training once or twice a week, what would your some real take home messages be for those coaches?
After you guys, go ahead.
Yeah. For me, we've got to understand as a coach and as players, and whether we're going to educate the players or they might tell you to understand what the actual game is. So I would be looking at tactical periodization in around that 15-16 age group, where you can have those conversations and you can get that understanding about what the physical, mental, technical point is about the game. But I think for the coach, the take home is we have got to understand what the game actually is, and whether it be how many decisions they're making, or whether it be how much they run, that intermittent part of the game that I spoke about. But if they could take away, like, each game is different. Like, we have presented a model, we've presented data around it, but there's actually no fixed point with any of this research. So, like, sometimes the players will run 7.5K. Sometimes the following week they could do 5.5K. They might have 10 tackles one week. They might make one the following week. So I think the nature of our game, it's not like the long jump where you just start at a particular point, hit a board and jump, and then you're done. There's so much more to it. We don't have that part. It is chaotic at times, and we've got to prepare our players for those moments.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
Jason,
I'd just add to that. You're absolutely right. Understand the game, but the biggest outcome for anything that we're trying to do is get better at rugby. Don't try and get people better at high speed running. Don't try and make them fitter, make them better rugby players. That's when that becomes the overarching aim, then all the other pieces of the puzzle tend to fall into place.
Yeah, and I think lastly from me, I guess it's all a process for me. Start with the end in mind through some broad expectations of a game model, shape intentions on a session by session basis, and then reflect on the reality through measurable outcomes.
Thank you, Mike. And I'm going to do one more because we're into added on time, and we're allowed added on time. And I think this is probably the situation. I'm really conscious of the irony that we are trying to support coaches during this time, and I think Leinster, St Mary's, and you guys for giving up with time have been really good. But the irony is that we're doing it in this forum rather than out on the pitch. So I guess that's the constraints we're living in at the moment. If I'm thinking now, let's hope we get back to contact sport, depending on where we are, August, September time. And this is a specific question from Glyn Howardson. How would we use a tactical periodisation approach within pre-season? So would we be pragmatic and focus on maybe specific physical qualities in each session, or would we have a more rounded approach? And maybe to looking at more of a community rugby setting where we've only got 2 or 3 sessions per week during that pre-season.
One thing I don't think we have touched upon in this is the idea that solutions can be quite original and quite creative. And I think pre-season is the time to really see if those things are pragmatic. So what I mean by that is when you watch the higher levels of the game, everyone seems to play in a similar way, but the rules allow different ways of playing. So if you can come up with original tactical solutions and use pre-season as a target to achieve those, I think it's a really good attempt at trying to solve rugby in your own way.
Any thoughts on pre-season, Brett and Jason, adopting this tactical periodisation approach?
I mean, I think that tactical periodisation certainly fits in very well, as I said earlier, with these extended in-season periods. There's no particular reason why you can't use it in the pre-season, but you've got less constraints because you don't have to get ready for a game every week. So, I mean, most periodization models progress from general to specific, right? And I'd say that what we've been talking about today is some highly specific forms of training. So, is there a reason not to do some very specific speed work in the preseason? I don't think so. At the same time, is there any particular benefit to getting guys fit by making them go on a 5K jog? No, that's probably not going to make them any better at catching or passing or seeing what defenders are doing. So, I'd probably again use some of these principles, but there's, like I say, there's a lot more degrees of freedom in a pre-season. But ultimately, you want to make the tactical outcomes your overall driver. So you want to go down there knowing what aspect of the game you want to get better at each preseason session.
Yeah, Jason, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think if there's aspects of your game that you need to work on, so if you want to make the best passing team in the world, come up with a game and activity that involves a lot of passing, that can improve that technique of passing, that the decision making around the passing, and be creative. What I think this model does, it allows us as coaches a freedom to put your philosophy there and let the players play and whatever area you want to work on, you have freedom to work with. But this can definitely be worked in that pre-season model without doubt.
Brilliant.